Okay, let's start. Good afternoon, good morning. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar on reducing overselling risks under Article 6. My name is Jörg Füßler. I'm working at INFRAS here in Zurich, Switzerland, and I think we have a very interesting panel of presenters and speakers this afternoon. Before that, I want to go into the housekeeping. So this is a webinar. I hope technically everything will work fine. You will find somewhere in the webinar system, there is a question box where you can enter questions. And I'd also like to invite you to use that and put in your questions. We will have a short introduction and then a presentation by two presenters, and after that we take some time really to discuss these topics and also have more general questions and comments. All that I would then like to ask you to put into the question box. But without further ado, I'd like to move to Nils Westling. Nils is the Program Manager for International Climate Cooperation of the Swedish Energy Agency, and he and his team has commissioned this report we will present later. With that, Nils, please start. I hope you can all see the presentation of Nils.
Thank you, Jörg. And would you please just click to the next slide right away? Thank you. And yeah, thank you, Jörg. Thank you also, Randall and Anik, for organizing this webinar. I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you for a very interesting report and talk briefly about why we commissioned this work. As you said, Jörg, my name is Nils Westling. I work for the Swedish Energy Agency, and this Swedish Energy Agency is a government administration with the task of implementing energy and climate policy measures, mainly domestically in Sweden, but also internationally. And one of our responsibilities is Sweden's program for international climate cooperation. With this program, we aim to support cost-effective mitigation activities through international climate cooperation and market mechanisms. We have managed Sweden's CDM portfolio since the early 2000s. And in that, we have, through projects in more than 50 countries, reduced emissions by more than 25 million tons of CO2 equivalents. And more is coming. However, we are not here to talk about the past, but to look forward towards the cooperative approaches under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And with that, next slide, please. So in 2017, the Swedish Parliament adopted a goal of carbon neutrality by 2045, negative emissions thereafter, and also a 2030 milestone target, which is more ambitious than what is required by Sweden in the EU Ndc. Domestic emission reductions are the main focus, but there will be a possibility to use complementary measures. And in complementary measures are included verified emission reductions in other countries, such as ITMOs. There could also be included bio-CCS, land use measures, or other negative emission technologies. A public investigation has analyzed this and delivered a report earlier this year, so it is now up to the government to decide on the way forward. However, for us at the Swedish Energy Agency, we currently direct most of our efforts towards preparing for climate cooperation under Article 6. We do that through the UNFCCC negotiations. We do it by developing knowledge and best practice. And we do it not least by developing concrete Article 6 cooperation programs and mitigation activities that can be implemented on the ground within the coming years. So as As you all know, the rule book is not yet finalized. The negotiations are postponed due to the pandemic, and there are few or none examples currently to study. So the situation is challenging. And one of the many challenges facing Article 6 implementation relates to avoiding overselling of emission reductions. And this follows from a number of important principles, and I wanted to mention or highlight two. First, that an Article 6 cooperation should help the host country reach its NDC target and also allow it to increase its ambition in the future NDC cycles. And naturally, it is difficult for any country to accurately estimate its emissions trajectory 5, 7, or even 10 years out into the future. And secondly, to avoid double counting of emission reductions, we as buyers will require corresponding adjustments, which means that an increase, well, it will mean an increase in the emissions in the host country from an accounting perspective in order to correspond to the decrease in the carbon budget of the buyer country. So in order to both help countries reach their goals and at the same time remain strict about corresponding adjustment, we must take the risk of overselling very seriously and act to minimize it. And it is therefore that we commissioned this report from these smart people at Carbon Limits, INFRAS, Stockholm Environment Institute, and Oeko Institute to help us, and also the wider carbon finance community, to think through this inherent Article 6 dilemma. The conclusions of the report are those of the authors, and they do not necessarily represent the Swedish Energy Agency, but that being said, we think that they did a very good job, and they presented some practical strategies to avoid overselling, which we hope can be useful for many others that share our ambition to promote cooperation and ambition raising under the Paris Agreement. And we also hope that this work will foster additional dialogue as rulemaking and piloting continue simultaneously. Thank you. Back to you, Jörg.
Thank you. Thank you, Niels, for that great introduction and setting the scene. With that, I will then move to the presenters of the report. We have Randall Spalding-Fetcher of Carbon Limits. I assume most of you know him. He's worked years and years, over 20 years, on international carbon markets with a focus on developing countries. He holds a Master of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and more recently a PhD from University of Cape Town. He's currently supporting the development of multiple Article 6 pilot programs, something that also Sweden luckily is pushing for. Also for he's working on domestic crediting schemes and other carbon pricing instruments. We have also my colleague Annick Kohli, who's also co-author together with me. She works in climate and environment, in the climate and environment team here at INFRAS. She has a Master in Arts of Political Science from University of Zurich and the LLM from the University of Edinburgh. Before joining us in INFRAS, she worked with the Swiss government with the Federal Office of the Environment and was a member of different Swiss delegations. Without further ado, I would like to ask Randall to start. I think he switched off the camera to improve bandwidth for the real important stuff. Randall.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. Can you see the presentation on the screen?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, great. So thank you, and thank you, Niels, for your introduction and also for the support of this important work. You probably would have seen in the invitation that this report is publicly available. So all we're doing today is just trying to touch on a few highlights of the results, but we certainly encourage you to have a look at the full report, and we welcome your feedback. Before I get into the meat of it, I actually want to say a couple of words in terms of context, which is really about this new world of international carbon markets and the difference course, between the Kyoto Protocol world and the Paris Agreement world, because now all countries have mitigation pledges. So it's a very, as Niels mentioned, there's this principle of no double counting. Everyone has pledges, only one country can use the transferred mitigation outcomes that we now are trying to manage under Article 6. So this is a very different playing field. And there's a term, I know many of you are carbon market experts, but some might not be, so you might not be familiar with this term, corresponding adjustments. That refers to what Niels mentioned. If a country transfers or sells mitigation outcomes, those then get added back to their inventory before they report on NDC progress. Just as for the acquiring or buying countries, they get to subtract those mitigation outcomes before they report on NDC progress. That's the whole way the trading works. And this terminology, mitigation outcomes, is a kind of a generic term that could be emission reductions or other units. And we also, in this presentation, you'll see we talk about acquiring and transferring, because that's the language of the Paris Agreement rather than buying and selling. But that's the context. In the report itself, we talk about a number of different types of overselling risk there, but we're going to really focus on the classic one, which is what's often called low-hanging fruit. How to avoid selling things that are inexpensive and that you need to reach your own NDC goals. And that presupposes that the country actually understands or has prioritized the available mitigation actions to achieve their NDC goals. So I'll say a couple of words about that. Uneek will then go through some of the practical strategies, and we'll say a word about capacity building. One thing I just want to say briefly, though, is that the strategies, when we explain them, they will sound as though it's only the transferring country doing this, but they could be applied or required by either side of the transaction. So either transferring or acquiring. It's just that the action to implement then typically takes place in the transferring country. But this is stuff that all countries should be thinking about in terms of how they manage their Article 6 cooperation. So before we talk about strategies, I think we need to understand this idea of how do countries actually think about how they will achieve their NDC. And I want to show you a classic tool that's used to think about this, which is a marginal abatement cost curve. So that basically this figure on the left shows every single column is a different mitigation opportunity. The x-axis of the graph shows increasing emission reductions in a target year from left to right, while the y-axis shows the cost. So we basically ranked a number of mitigation options from least expensive to most expensive. Now, the country may not choose what we call their NDC package purely based on cost. There could be other issues involved. How well do these align with their other development policies? What kind of COVID benefits exist? What barriers exist? So in this very simple example I showed, you have a whole bunch of options on the left. A couple of them drop out because they don't align with the country's other priorities. So you're left with 7 different options, which in this case yields 70 million tons of emission reductions. That's what we're going to call the NDC package. The point here is, if this is the most cost-effective way and policy-aligned way for the country to reach their goal, you don't want to transfer the emission reductions or to use these for trading, because then you could be stuck with something that's more expensive. And Anik will go into the detail of how we do that. I think we'll switch presenters now.
Okay, great. I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, yes.
Very good. So for the first group of strategies, the idea is that the transferring country ensures it does not use mitigation activities for international cooperation that it needs for its NDC, based on an analysis as just elaborated by Randall on the previous slide. So the reason is the transferring country would need to replace these mitigation activities with other, maybe higher cost or otherwise more difficult interventions. So for example, one strategy could be to create a negative list of mitigation activities that are part of the NDC package and can therefore not be used for Article 6 cooperation. Such a list would have the advantage that it's very transparent, so that potential project developers can easily see if their project would be excluded or not. And it would be quick to implement in case, of course, that such an NDC mitigation analysis is already done. The disadvantage is that the list only includes technology or project types. So for example, if a country's NDC implementation plan requires 50% electricity vehicle penetration, and electricity vehicles are entirely excluded from Article 6 cooperation, the transferring country could not sell mitigation outcomes for electricity vehicle penetration beyond 50%. So it's a bit a static approach, this list. Other possibilities or strategies that are presented in the report are a positive list to use Article 6 for implementing inaccessible technologies. And then a third strategy would be setting an abatement cost threshold. So based on the NDC package, the marginal cost of meeting the NDC target is estimated, and only activities whose abatement costs are above this would be authorized. And then a final strategy would be to incorporate NDC pledges into the baseline for crediting programs, so that only mitigation activities that go further than the interventions identified for the NDC target would be eligible for crediting. For the further details, please, or I refer you to the report. So the next group of strategies, there is the idea, the idea is to not transfer all the mitigation outcomes that could potentially be generated from an activity. So, for example, one strategy would be just a simple division of mitigation outcomes from cooperative activities. So, according to this strategy, a wide range of Article 6 cooperation is allowed, which is more flexible than just the previous strategy presented, but only a share of the mitigation outcomes would then be transferred internationally. Again, this strategy has the advantage that it's very transparent and simple. The disadvantage is that it's quite difficult to choose the right level of sharing. First of all, there need to be enough mitigation outcomes for the transferring country to still reach its NDC. But there need to be also enough for the acquiring country so that it remains attractive for it to actually cooperate. And the more the transferring country holds back, the higher the price per ton CO2 is that the acquiring country has to pay. And this again then decreases the competitiveness of the transferring country in relation to other suppliers of ITMOs. Yeah, so there are advantages and disadvantages. Other strategies that we present in the report would be to have longer or have limited crediting periods, because long crediting periods could contribute to a higher risk of overselling in case of increasing ambition and wider scope of NDCs during an update during a crediting period. Then a third strategy would be to set conservative baselines. So the idea is to use these conservative baselines that are in accordance with the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement rather than the NDC target. This ensures that the transferring country does not sell too much of what it needs itself to reach its NDC. And then a final strategy would be to make all transfers of mitigation outcomes conditional. So only if the transferring country achieves its NDC, or is at least on track to achieve it, the mitigation outcomes would be actually transferred. Again, all these strategies have advantages and disadvantages. And then the final group of strategies applies pricing to set aside funding for additional mitigation if necessary. Let me go to the next slide for the explanation of one of these strategies. This strategy would be a two-part pricing to reflect opportunity costs. So the figure shows possible interventions and their costs. 7 interventions have been selected for the Ndc package, so for meeting the Ndc target. All interventions to the left of the black line, showing the Ndc goal, are selected. So, but there could be other low-cost options that are not shown here because they faced barriers or did not align with the policy priorities. The marginal cost of the Ndc is here set at $20 per ton CO2. So mitigations options in the Ndc package could potentially have 2 components of price if the transferring countries decides to export mitigation options. There could be a payment to the project implementer, which equals the abatement cost of the intervention. If we look at the intervention B, it would be at $7. And then there would be a payment to the transferring country's government that equals the gap between the abatement cost and the marginal cost of the Ndc, which would be a total of $13, which is the green area on the graph. So this allows the transferring country to replace the transferred mitigation outcomes with other activities, be it even from selling internationally as well, buying internationally. So the advantage of this strategy is that it allows mitigation activities from all Ndc sectors. And the additional revenue provides flexibility to ensure the Ndc achievements. The disadvantages are this: assessing the marginal costs is very difficult and actually a major undertaking. And the strategy seems to be also more feasible for multi-donor funds or large acquiring countries because more elaborate negotiations are necessary, for example, on administrative procedures related to the timing and the trigger of the payments. A final strategy that we mention in the report is charging a levy to fund the mitigation outcome reserve or further ITMO purchases. So the transferring country would allow full transfer of any mitigation outcome generated, but charge a levy or a tax on those transfers, which then would be paid into a reserve fund. And this fund could then be used for additional mitigation activities. Okay, that's the overview of the strategies we present in our report, and I hand back to Randall for the rest of the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just get this restarted here on the right slide. Okay, so in the report, we did a qualitative assessment of each of these 10 strategies, or is it 10 or 11 strategies, on 3 different criteria. One is, to what extent do they actually reduce the risk of overselling? Secondly, what kind of burden do they place on government in terms of the administration of that strategy? And thirdly, how do they actually affect the market? How does it affect the volumes that might be involved in transfers? I'm not going to go through all of these details here, but I just want to highlight a couple of things in terms of the assessment. You can see this has been done from kind of highly positive to highly negative on each of these criteria. So one important issue is that you'll see the government burden column is split in 2. And that's because if a country already has done that detailed mitigation costing analysis, some of these are fairly easy to implement, like the negative list is very easy to implement. But if they haven't done that, of course, that would be a burden, right? Because they have to do that mitigation analysis before they could even implement one of these strategies. So that's important. The second thing is, you know, in principle, the only way to be absolutely sure that you won't miss your goal is to have full conditionality of transfers. But as you'll see to the right there, that's the red box means you're not going to have any activity then, because no project proponent would probably want to take the risk of investing in a cooperative program and getting nothing out of it because the country missed their goals. So Our sense is that probably for countries who have mitigation analysis, which many countries have done that for their NDC, the negative list might be a good place to start, because it does give you a pretty good security in terms of overselling risks, and the burden is fairly low if you already know what those options are you want to have in your NDC package. But again, I think the important thing is that this is going to vary by country. I mean, what we took away from this, first of all, the starting point, overselling is a real risk. And in fact, I think there are many potential transferring countries that are hesitating to engage in some of these Article 6 activities because they just don't know where they stand. And secondly, no one strategy is going to fit each country, right? It's going to depend. It'll depend on the different countries, the ambition or the type of their NDC pledges, the available mitigation options they have, and the data that's available on those, as well as the capacity that government has to manage one or more of these strategies. So each country really needs to think through this. And as part of that, I mean, we have a whole section in the report on capacity building. But the one thing I'll highlight here is that this detailed mitigation analysis is absolutely essential. And just as a caveat, we don't mean only an economic analysis of mitigation. This means understanding both the economics and the abatement potential of those different options, as well as their alignment with other policies, their co-benefits, the barriers they face. So that kind of very comprehensive view that countries need to take to develop an NDC implementation plan, that must be in place. Without some of that information, it's very difficult for countries to even consider some of these strategies. So we would suggest that should really be the priority for the short term. So with that, we end the presentation, and I'll turn it back to Jörg, and we can go through some questions.
Great. Thank you, Randall. I would like to invite all the presenters to put on the camera now for this discussion. I have to mention that we have over 100 participants, so I need your understanding that we will not be able to go into all the questions. They have already some questions been coming in. That's very good. Let me start with a first one, which comes from Paolo Cozzi, who asks about the level where this should be implemented. So his question is, what level do you see the strategies proposed for preventing overselling being implemented at the country level? Are there any that would be implemented at the level of COP decisions? I mean, it's a big question what the COP decisions will look like. Who wants to think about what the COP ideally might be willing to present on this? Randall?
I mean, I would just say briefly, personally, I'm not expecting the COP to act on any of these. Yes, it would be wonderful if they would, but I just think in the short run, it's much more likely that either individual countries will do this to protect their own interests, or through bilateral arrangements, or even club arrangements, along the line of the San Jose principles or other groups of principles, you see these implemented. So, and maybe the way to think about it is that a lack of international agreement on some of these should not prevent countries from acting on them, because they are able to act on them individually or plurilaterally.
Yes, Annick?
May I add here as well that, as Randall said on the last slide, it really also depends on the countries, what they already have, what their assessment is, and their conditionalities. So it's also difficult, or it's not possible to have one solution that fits everyone, and therefore it really is up to the countries bilaterally or as a group to decide what fits to really mitigate risks in their own countries.
Thanks. Then we have two questions, one from Aglaya, another from Eduardo Reyes, concerning the conditionality of the NDC targets. Do you consider only unconditional or also conditional NDC targets when ensuring NDC achievements? What would the list baseline first set of options be based on? Not sure, Randall. I mean, you are the one who one of the few who can crack sometimes that box of the conditional versus the unconditional. What's your take here?
So we have deliberately avoided that distinction in the paper. So my sense is that there's a real disagreement in the policy community about this. On one hand, corresponding adjustments apply to everything. So, I mean, that's what my understanding will be. So, to say, oh, we'll use Article 6 to contribute to your conditional goal is a little bit difficult because those transfers will always incur a corresponding adjustment. So they cannot move you to a lower level of kind of adjusted emissions. So in that sense, strictly speaking, if you wanted to incorporate an NDC goal into the baseline, it probably should be the conditional goal. But I know there's a lot of disagreement over what countries meant when they made those conditional commitments and what kind of obligations do they actually have to meet conditional commitments. So, there's a kind of school of people who says, no, let's use the unconditional ones. But I just think the main thing is the corresponding adjustment is going to happen either way, regardless of what manifestation your goals have. So you cannot reduce your net kind of adjusted emissions through Article 6 cooperation.
Thanks. Then there are, I tried to summarize now some of the questions, but there are some questions that ask, in my understanding, about the relationship between avoiding overselling for host countries and the setting of baselines and additionality. To which extent are they linked? Do you have to do baseline setting differently? Who wants to take that? I mean, if you have the positive lists, right? This also is a kind of additionality, but it's not completely the same. Maybe we are just digging up research questions we have to work on further because I think these are really interesting questions, and there are several. I think there is a certain link.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, I think a little bit about, we're not trying to make a statement about additionality through these overselling. They are, in fact, what we didn't show is that there's a section in the report that talks about different types of overselling risk. We've been talking about low-hanging fruit. There's another risk, which is what if you sell emission reductions that aren't real? So what if you sell units that were derived from an activity that were not additional? Well, what's going to happen then is that your inventory doesn't actually decline. You still add back the corresponding adjustment, which means as a host country, you're in a worse position now. You've moved further away from your goals. So in that sense, you'll read in a lot of papers, there is a kind of built-in incentive now in this kind of cooperation, assuming you have an ambitious goal, which I know is a big assumption, then there's a built-in incentive to make sure that the emission reductions are additional. Because otherwise, it actually hurts the transferring country. But just because you allow the possibility of an Article 6 code doesn't mean you don't need some separate additionality analysis of that intervention. Yeah, that's all I would say.
Mm-hmm. Another question goes a bit into the field of readiness. Maybe it's one for Annick. This question is from Hanna Marie. Who is asking, can you see Article 6 as an incentive to develop an NDC implementation plan, which is needed anyway for an NDC implementation? Can it start in a priority sector or focus on activities outside the NDC scope? So what does that mean for host countries, Annick?
Well, I guess ideally each country would have done the analysis before doing an NDC to really assess whether the target that they propose is ambitious or not, or appropriate or not. But of course, we know how some of the NDCs have been developed, so this is not the case for all the countries, and therefore, yeah, having the Article 6 cooperation could be an incentive to do the analysis now and go into more details. And of course, it could also be done sector by sector. That it doesn't need to be done for the whole economy and for the whole country at once. That you could focus, but that of course then again depends a bit on what kind of target the country has. But it could be a way of starting the analysis and have, as we said, very often the capacity building is needed because it's quite a difficult analysis, and so that could be a start. Yes.
Good. Let's go to the next question, which is also something that came out in. Randall, go ahead. Add.
Just something to this. It also came up in the paper that we did about Article 6 and ambition. Is that, I mean, NDC implementation plan is the priority up to 2030, but there's also these long-term plans. And we would also suggest, and we mentioned this in the report, that even in your long-term planning, you need to start thinking through where does Article 6 fit in that long-term plan? Because that's, in a way, how to deal with some of both the short-term overselling issues and the kind of longer-term perverse incentives, is to lay out very clearly how each country sees utilizing that type of cooperation so that they get to where they want to be in 2045 or 2050.
Yeah, I think the next questions, they are around one of the crunch issues that we also saw in the interviews that we did. So these are questions from Gayan, but also from Stefan, which are about host country readiness. So one question is, what is the advice if you do not know the abatement costs of our mitigation options, right? That's a typical situation. Countries don't have that knowledge already and don't know the costs, don't know where to start. Stefan asks, many developed countries have not yet identified all the policies and measures required to meet their NDC. Is this mitigation and analysis really a reality for many developing countries in short term? What about for least developed countries, right? I mean, we have all these capacity building activities, but right now, I think these are very important questions, how to start quickly if there is not a lot. Of course, ideal world, one would have all that information in all the countries, but what are ways to start? Who wants to take that?
I guess, Randall, you're more the expert on the ground.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things, and these are really good points, I think. Some of the strategies, so for example, in terms of pricing, I think one rule of thumb would be if you don't really know your full set of mitigation options and you have a sense that your NDC is reasonably ambitious, you certainly do not want to be negotiating $2 or $3 or $4 a ton for an Article 6 program. So there's a major shift in thinking that has to happen. In fact, there was a paper that came out from First Climate and Perspectives that developed some scenarios for ITBO pricing. And we really have to shift to be thinking kind of $10 to $30, not $5 to $10. So that would be one thing, is to think about, well, if we get a reasonably high price, that gives us some insurance to know that, even if this was something we were going to put in our implement ourselves, we can still afford to implement something else. The other possibility is the sharing of mitigation outcomes. That might be a place to start. Even the shorter crediting periods that Anik mentioned, all those things kind of buy you some time and flexibility while you sort out the details of understanding your mitigation analysis. But the question about LDCs is absolutely an appropriate one. I mean, the interesting thing is that we don't even have the next COP until next November, right? There's no reason that virtually every country could not have at least a basic mitigation option analysis. before next November. And I understand, of course, we'd like to start piloting before then, but this, you know, this kind of work at a fairly generic level is not that difficult, but it just has to be done. So I would really encourage all the people engaged in capacity building programs and those funding capacity building programs to prioritize this. It's not a huge amount of money. It can be done. It has been done in many countries already. We just need to make it happen, I think.
Thanks. I mean, just to add, I think it's also important to see that if you are trying to do like a larger scale wind project or other low carbon infrastructure projects, then you need quite a lot of planning, and then this planning of the NDC side is not huge compared to that. On the other hand, I think it's very important to note that some countries are not ready yet, and they should also be able to access Article 6 and need help to get that data on the ground to be able to start. We have a question from Sophie, which maybe I take even. This is about the hot air issue. She writes that have you evaluated also the fact that some NDCs are not ambitious? Targets are below business as usual, and they contain a lot of so-called hot air. For them, it is not a problem to add corresponding adjustments to their inventory, and there is no playing field with other host countries, selling countries which have more ambitious NDCs and of course have higher prices. And I think, and probably we all think, this is a very important issue. What surprised me though when working on this paper is that it seems there are quite some countries who really see this overselling topic as a real issue, and that's also encouraging, even if the NDC is not super clear. Many host countries think they have an obligation to meet them, and they cannot sell just units and hope for the best that they will then meet their own domestic mitigation target. So I think there are countries where the NDCs have too much hot air or have hot air, but I think it's also really a topic in many countries that need to take care of that. And the important point is it's not only the costs, right? Not only the marginal abatement costs. This is one of the many factors countries look at, but it's also their in industrial priorities, and what kind of technologies do they have access to, what not. I mean, the work, for instance, Carsten Warnecke did. I think these are all different ways to look at it. In my view, the important point is that countries have a process also between the ministry to agree on where to start with the implementation of their own NDC, and where they can use and add Article 6 activity on top of that. I look at the question list here. One question from Eduardo that came in earlier is also about the abatement costs. The presenter refers to abatement cost, which is a good way to look at it. However, when you do abatement, you do it most of the time at the national level or at the sector level. Could you clarify how a reduction emission project may be reflected into the abatement opportunity? Actually, I don't fully understand this. Yeah, I think one question is also to which extent the abatement action is then reflected in the greenhouse gas in inventory of the country, which has to do with the whole the accounting within the country, the accounting towards the UNFCCC. Maybe you have thought about that. What's the importance of also the national inventory, and to which extent this can reflect the mitigation action?
Anik, you want to address that?
Well, in the paper, we described the different overselling risks, and one of the risks is that if your national inventory is not detailed enough, you might sell something that you actually don't have, so selling non-existent fruits, as we call it in our paper. So that definitely is something that you needed to address. But I don't know if you can add something on that, Randall.
I mean, we didn't focus so much on that in this particular paper because there are other papers about that. I mean, in a way, the strategy in that case is about increasing disaggregation of your inventory. It's not about conditional transfers or a negative list or something like that. So yes, it is an issue. It's a different kind of overselling risk, and it is addressed in a number of other papers, including some from INFRAS. I think INFRAS and SEI and Oeko Institute.
Good, thanks. We can also take more questions now. Let me see. Here is a question from Owen. Does this suggest a hierarchy of checks? First, Ndc ambition, second, not oversold, and third, additional, i.e. an ITMO is good, in parentheses, if it meets the three criteria. So can we build from our overselling strategic advice a kind of a check for good ITMOs, right? So this would be the link in my understanding. Owen, you correct me if I don't get it right, but the idea is, does this work allow to define additional criteria for selecting good ITMOs? So it shouldn't be only additional, you shouldn't only look at the NDC of the host country to make sure that your unit doesn't come out of hot air, etc. But a new criteria, it's not an overselling unit which may put the host country under stress to meet its NDC target.
I would say it could definitely, or it should actually even be another criteria added to the list of criteria that you need to make sure that the quality of the units that you buy or sell are assured, or that, yeah, there is additionality, of course, and so on. So it's definitely a criteria, and it could be, or one thing we also discuss in the paper is that certain countries, especially buying countries, could even have such criteria in their national laws to assure that all the entities involved, because there's not just one entity in each country, and things are getting complex, so that all the entities involved in the country do know about these criteria and know which ones they have to adhere to. And so that could definitely be a criteria that could, for example, be mentioned or introduced in the national law, even ideally.
And you even see this now if you look at, say, what some of the work of TCAF and even the Swedish Energy Agency, when they had a call for Article 6 pilots, this is mentioned. So they do talk about, they obviously want to work with countries that have ambitious goals. They want to collaborate on kind of appropriate baseline approaches, but ensuring against overselling is also often part of those discussions. So I think there's what I'm heartened by is that there is a real awareness of this issue on the buying side, at least amongst those that are active in pilot activities, right? So I think I think this will be part of the conversation on both sides.
Yeah, of course, there is a bit of doubling, because if a project is truly additional, then the overselling risk is mitigated, but it's not the full picture, of course, because a country could sell off low-cost potential mitigation potential and have then to pay more, for instance, for meeting its own NDC.
Yeah, so your comment on that.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right, because I mean, the first challenge is, in a way, if countries already all had detailed NDC implementation plans, this wouldn't be an issue, right? Because if they had decided they were going to use energy efficient lighting as one of their options, and they put in place a policy incentive to make that happen, just to keep it real simple, like a subsidy on lights, then if you evaluated that with traditional crediting approaches, it wouldn't look additional, right? The problem is that most countries haven't gotten that far yet to number one, know exactly what they want to do, and number two, how they're going to do it. So we're in this in-between period, which is why this, in a way, you need this additional layer of deliberately thinking about overselling risk. Again, my hope would be, as we get closer in the later 2020s, this won't be quite such an issue because countries will have made those decisions and have specific policy instruments in place to implement what we've called the Ndc package, and it will make it very clear that those are not appropriate areas for Article 6 cooperation.
Good, thanks. So we are slowly getting to the end. I take this. If you have urgent questions, please type them now. I have one question, which is, I think, also very good from Gayan, which is about the host country perspective. I think it's a bit the question, what's in it for the host country? So the question goes, how do we factor other benefits, co-benefits, social costs and national circumstances into these analyses, which are often difficult to be quantified, right? I think in the real situation of a host country, limited data availability and other huge pressing needs. So how do you factor that in?
Well, I mean, you do need to look at it when you do what we called the NDC package analysis, that you not only look at the costs, economic costs, but that you look at the wider picture, what is also politically feasible, what does align with the national policy, and then of course, as we discussed for some of the strategies, there are costs that apply to the project developers, and then there are costs for the whole society. And as a government deciding on what activities you want to use for your NDC or Article 6, you do need to look at both costs, like the economic costs for the society and the project costs. So it does need to be part of the analysis for sure, yeah.
I could even just give one example, so because this is in the public domain. So when Colombia did their NDC analysis, they had a very detailed study done by the University of Los Andes that looked at a large number of mitigation options across the whole economy. And there were some examples. So for example, in kind of sustainable and passive, sustainable design, passive building design, architecture, and then also I think in steel manufacturing, there were some examples of options that were on paper very low mitigation cost, even negative mitigation costs for the ones on buildings, but they felt there was not the technical knowledge and expertise to actually implement those. So they were not included in the NDC package, right? So that might be an example. Even if you'd implemented this, say, negative list strategy we talk about, you might be able to come and collaborate with someone on one of those because it would not be excluded. And in fact, it would be a very cost-effective way to reduce emissions.
Great. We have a question from Marco, who goes into the approach we defined that in NDC package. And his question is, wouldn't it be better from the onset just or easier also to select from the onset mitigation actions outside of that package. And just try to do a separate thing. This is Article 6 and tries to be as far removed from the Ndc package, so to speak, from the beginning, rather than trying to mix the two.
Yes, it would be. The problem is, as one of the other earlier questioners said, not every country knows what that package is. So yes, first prize I think would be, you know exactly what you want to do and you know it very well. And you say, great, everything outside of that is fair game. But we have to figure out how to navigate the in-between time where not all countries have that.
And I mean, some of the strategies that we present are at least an attempt that if you don't have this analysis done yet, that you can then try to do it. For example, using a baseline in line with the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
By that, even if your NDC is not very clear or not very ambitious, you would assure that everything then what is sold beyond this baseline is really not used for the transferring country to reach its own target. So, so some of the strategies we present try to provide options on that.
Good, and then we have a killer question, so to speak, from Sandeep. His question is quite simple. What happens if overselling happens? And the second is if the transferring country keeps it open without implementing any of the strategy. So this is a kind of a not well-defined situation in the country. What happens if this overselling happens?
I mean, what happens is it would have difficulties to reach its own target, its NDC target, and probably only with high cost options or with options where the capacities are not there or would need to be built up. So yeah, that I guess in the end, those are some of the major concerns, or that yeah, why we even talk about it.
And of course, the Paris Agreement framework is such that it's not like there's a financial penalty for countries not reaching their goals, right? It's the nature of the cooperation is every country is doing their best to get there. There's a facilitation part of the compliance mechanism, I think it's called, but in a way, if you miss your goal, you miss your goal. What's interesting to think about, of course, is from the inquiring country's point of view and how they report to their taxpayers, right? And I think SEA was helpful in pointing out there's a real reputational risk for acquiring countries, right? If they are seen as collaborating on a program and then the partner country misses their NDC target, right? So in a way, the implications come through not just in the international rules, the implications also come through in the domestic political system and what type of domestic climate regulation, which of course within that country is enforceable.
Okay, great. So if there are more questions, but I think we need to stop here. The hour is over. But I would like to have from you both a last thought about what does that mean, or what are next steps that you see for host countries or for acquiring countries on implementing this. So what would be steps on the ground to move this forward? Because we see in many countries, in many host countries, that there is a need for getting in order their plans to implement in NDCs. It's often not clear which ministry is doing what, who is allowed to do Article 6, but also on the acquiring country side, there are lots of questions. Should they have their own criteria for buying units that have to be met? What should these criteria look like? Maybe last thoughts before we close that. Should we start with Annick?
I mean, what we do mention in our report is that one possible next step could be that we do some case studies or implementing cases to see which of the strategies could be applied and what are the challenges and what kind of capacity building is needed, and to get some experience out of that. And if we could have several of these case studies, we could further detail the strategies and learn from these first corporations also for the next years. So that's one thing we discuss in the report.
Randall?
For me, the big takeaway is that countries need an Article 6 strategy, right? I mean, overselling is one component of that, but things like institutional arrangements, how to be proactive and kind of engaging, this is so important. And for those of you who've been around for a number of years, you will remember there was something called National CDM Strategy Studies many, many years ago from the World Bank, which helped countries to scope this out. And I think there's a little bit of that happening. The PMR is supporting that type of work in Turkey, Jordan, and Colombia. So there's a little bit, but I'd like to see much more of it, because if the goal is a thriving international carbon market that contributes to the goals of the Paris Agreement, that is not going to happen by accident. And it's also not going to happen by focusing on particular actions. Countries need to understand, how do we approach this? What's in it for us? What's the right thing to do, and how do we implement that? So I hope we'll see more of that.
Thanks, Randall. Thanks for these words for empowerment. I think that's something that we all learned during the last long years. It's important that the knowledge is there, that the host countries are able to act based on data and the potentials they have. With that, I'd like to close. I put the link to the report into the chat window, so if you want to read that, we'd also be happy to hear your feedback in the chat box or later, or you can send us an email through our websites of INFRAS, of carbon limits, or SEA. I would like to send out a great thank you to the SEA for supporting this study. I would like to thank the presenters and also the participants with these excellent questions. I'm still amazed to have over 100 participants for a topic which is, to put it mildly, a bit special or nerdy, but I think these are really important questions for many countries that have to be solved soon if Article 6 project should take off and be able to scale up. With that, I thank you and wish you a nice day. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks everybody.